Okay, so good evening, everybody. I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight. All reserves coordinators are involved with the Lothians SWT reserves. We'll start off the meeting with Julian Warman, who is the SWT Reserves Manager. And Julian will talk about the conservation in the Lothians. We'll then move on to Tim Duffy, who is heavily involved in planning issues associated with the Scottish Wildlife Trust. And Tim will talk to us about the red moss of Balerno. We'll then move on to Pete Sykes, who is involved in the Reserves Management Group. And he will talk about Milk Hall Pond. Following that, Nick Warren, who is the chair of the Lothians SWT, he will talk about Johnston Terrace Gardens. Following that will be Leslie Fairweather, who will talk about she will talk about Woodhall Dean, which is out near Dunbar. That will be followed by David Ross, who will talk about the SWT tree nursery. And at the end, Julian will come back in and give us a wrap up. As I said, we're going to try and keep this to 2 people, 10 minutes each with a 2-minute warning. So let me just admit a few other people and we will then ask Julian to start. So Julian, would you like to unmute yourself and share your screen?
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we can, Julian. Yeah, hi.
Great, okay, right, I'll start. Okay, good evening. My name is Julian Warman and I am the Scottish Wildlife Trust's Reserves Manager for South East Scotland with responsibility for 25 reserves in 5 local authority areas. The Scottish Borders, the East Lothian, Mid Lothian, West Lothian. My presentation this evening will just look at some of the 19 trust reserves in the remaining natural, semi-natural wildlife habitat in this region. Of the 19 reserves, 8 are owned by the trust, 9 are managed by agreement with the owner, and 2 are a combination of both. So starting off, what's the point of wildlife reserves and what are they for? Well, it's estimated that the UK has lost 97% of its wildflower meadows, 94% of its lowland raised bogs, and the area of semi-natural woodland that remains in the UK is tiny at 1.2%. These habitats take thousands of years to form and are incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to recreate in any meaningful way once they have gone. If we are serious about conserving nature, it is therefore vitally important that all remaining semi-natural habitat is conserved and enhanced. The function of trust wildlife reserves is primarily to provide homes for wildlife and thereby help to safeguard a wide range of species found throughout Scotland. We also hope reserves give an example to others to carry out similar management on their land and provide enjoyment, information and education to people. The work the Trust does on its reserves tries to improve conditions for wildlife and where possible, provide access for people. Work on Trust reserves is undertaken by SWT staff such as myself, reserve project officers. We have an army of volunteers working on the reserves in the Lothians, and we also from time to time need to bring in specialist contractors. 13 of the 19 reserves in the Lothians have a voluntary reserve convener, and you'll be hearing from some of the reserve conveners talk about their reserves after me. The type of work to enhance reserves for wildlife varies depending on the reserve and the type of habitat. I'll describe some of the techniques that are undertaken on the habitats found on reserves in the Lothians. Several of our reserves in the Lothians are managed for their species-rich, flower-rich grasslands, which are important sites for rare flowering plants and invertebrates associated with this type of grassland. If left unmanaged, grasslands can soon become dominated by coarse grass species that outcompete the flowering plants that are vital for many insects. These grasslands need to be managed annually by cutting and raking or grazing. This is an area of species-rich grassland at Linhouse Glen that includes a good population of butterfly orchids you can see in the photograph. This is managed by annually cutting and raking it in late summer, autumn. It would be really good if we could graze Linhouse Glen with cattle, but unfortunately access is via a pedestrian level crossing across the railway. So getting cattle onto the reserve isn't possible at Linhouse Glen. But at Lyn Dean, which is just off the Sutra Hill, is a reserve which is grazed by a neighbour's stock, which we do through a grazing licence signed with the neighbour, and he puts his cattle on there each year. Lyn Dean supports a really good example of species-rich grassland that includes common rock rose, the food plant for the northern brown Argus butterfly, so it's doubly important. So we also use our own animals to graze reserves, such as Chevese sheep and Shetland cattle. This began about 20 years ago when SWT first started the flying flock and used sheep to graze reserves. And then about 10 years ago, we started purchasing cattle for grazing reserves. And each species has its own attributes for grazing sites. And the flying flock had to come into being because we weren't able to always get a neighbour or a third party to graze our reserves. So it fell to us to actually have our own stock and do that ourselves. This photo also shows how grazing animals are not only excellent at managing grassland, but benefit wetland areas such as this pond at Boresinch and Duddonston Lock, where the cattle removed the reed maze, which was choking it, and restored the open water in the course of one winter grazing season. It's quite a tough job to do by hand, and the cattle just did it so much faster and much more efficiently. Reserves are usually grazed during the autumn and winter and left ungrazed whilst plants are flowering in the spring and summer. The timing and amount of grazing is critical as species-rich grasslands can be damaged by both overgrazing and undergrazing. Reserves such as Longridge Moss, pictured here, red moss of Balerno and tail end moss are lowland raised bogs. These are areas of deep peat that have formed since the end of the last ice age, which is about 10,000 years ago. And the peat can be up to 8 meters deep in places. In the past, ditches were dug across raised bogs to drain them. To reverse the drying out of the peat and to raise them, the trust has installed dams using plastic piling, as is pictured here. These dams are made of sections that are hammered into the ditch and thereby dam the ditch. And you see how effective they can be. As well as being beneficial for biodiversity, re-wetting peat using dams can prevent bogs emitting carbon dioxide and so mitigates against climate change. The Peatland Action Project, funded by the Scottish Government and run by Nature Scot, aims to restore damaged peatlands across Scotland. Drying out of bogs leads to colonisation by scrub and trees, which leads to further drying out of the peat. It's important, therefore, that scrub and trees are removed to conserve the open peatland vegetation associated with deep peat. This is either done manually, as pictured at Red Moss, by cutting and pulling, or as is done at Longridge Moss, where we're able to put sheep on, and the sheep essentially do the job for us. The management of woodland reserves is focused on maximising native tree species, which involves felling native species that were either planted by past owners or spread by seed. This photo shows an area of felled lodgepole pine, a species native to Western North America that was planted at Addy-Welbeing, and in this case was cleared by contractors and was funded by landfill tax. Once non-native trees are are removed, native trees are either planted or natural colonisation occurs to increase the naturalness of the woodland, which in turn creates a more attractive woodland for wildlife. The Trust also spends many hours controlling and removing invasive non-native plants on reserves. These are plant species collected abroad and brought to the UK by plant collectors, originally as garden plants. Unfortunately, a number have adapted extremely well to their new home, escaped from gardens and become well established in the wild. This photo shows volunteers at Boar's Inch and Dudingston Loch clearing a shrub that's native to North America. The red osier dogwood dominated the wetter areas around Dudingston Loch to exclusion of all other species. It was just a monoculture of this dogwood. Now the dogwood has been removed, these areas are now covered in native wetland vegetation. It was really impressive how that came back so soon after the dogwood had gone. The list is long, but a few of the not invasive non-native plant species found on trust reserves in the Lothians includes Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed, giant hogweed, snowberry, spirea, and fewford leek. Trust volunteers, contractors and staff also undertake a wide range of wildlife surveys, be it animal and plants. This photo shows a bat box at Lothian Glen being checked as part of the monitoring scheme. The boxes are checked periodically and occupants recorded to provide a record of the bat species present on the reserve. Bat boxes must only be checked by a licensed bat worker.
Julian, at 2-minute warning.
Okay. Access provision is also a big part of reserve management, so visitors can access and appreciate trust reserves such as the construction of this bridge across a gorge at Woodhall Dean and the circular boardwalk at Moss of Balerno that is suitable for use by wheelchair users. Access provision varies from reserve to reserve, so before planning a visit, please check the Trust website where you'll find details on access provision for each reserve in the Lothians. Many thanks for listening, and I'll now hand you over. That's me, Alan.
Stop sharing your screen. Hello. Okay. Our next speaker is Tim Duffy. Tim, you're there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's just get going. I have 10 minutes to talk about the Red Moss of Balerno. Good evening. Hope everybody can see that. My name is Tim Duffy, and I've been convener of the Red Moss of Balerno since 2000. Welcome to the Moss. You probably know where it is, as it's extremely well known and the northern gateway to the Pennant Hills. At the end, I'll show you a map if you haven't been there before. We welcome visitors. We try and discourage bikers using the splendid circular boardwalk that gives great access to the public on the site that Julian has mentioned already. And about 15 years ago, we made it wheelchair accessible right round the boardwalk. When you're there, it basically looks like this. There is short heather covering it, but it is definitely a raised bog. And you can see this more clearly in the dome effect going up above you from the boardwalk in this photograph. As we've heard, there's a circular boardwalk, and it gives you good access to the variety of habitat types that there are there. The main one, of course, being a lowland raised bog. And you can see aspects of it in that vision. There are all sorts of critters there, from hairy ones to interesting plants. This is crowberry rather than the even rarer cranberry, but it's very nice. And of course, there are critters, amphibians, and yes, there are a few adders, if you're lucky enough to see them. But basically, it is there for its plants, its bog plants, nutrient poor ground, very little nutrient in the soil. But of course, it is most loved for, and possibly named for, the mosses, of which many of them are very red, People do not know whether the red moss of Balerno is named after the red mosses there, or whether it's named after the heather, the ling heather in the autumn going red. It is a coincidence that SWT has the two reserves called red moss. The other one is a red moss of Netherley near Stonehaven. Both of them managed by the Trust, both of them SSIs, and both of them bogs. But those are the only two named red mosses in Scotland. The beautiful colours of the sphagnum and the mosses produce beautiful mosaics, very colourful, and worth noting, colourful all year round. That is to say, in winter, it's still worth visiting this reserve because most of the colour is there, even if not even more. Other red species, of course, include the sundews. These are the sticky insect-catching little red discs that bogs are famous for. And if you go there in May, June, July, you'll see many hundreds of these plants right close to the boardwalk. The boardwalk is interpreted as you go around, and that's the best site for getting a really close-up view of the sundew. The boardwalks are well used by the public and our members, and the reserve is very, very busy. It's always been very busy for visitors because of its location at the northern entrance to Pennant Hills Park. I'll say more about that in a moment. What are we doing on the reserve to keep it a bog and to make it a better bog? Well, for decades now, through teams run by Julian and through Lothians conservation volunteers, there has been damming going on in the reserve to prevent water loss from the old drains that they tried to put in the 19th century to make this fertile land. They never completed that job, and this has been a fragment of bog for a very long time. These dams, as you can see, they run down the old drains, have been doing a very good job in holding back the water and reducing the rate of water loss. That's what it's about. Water comes in from rain, not from any other source, so there's no other nutrients coming in. And it's all about reducing the rate of water loss. All over the bog, you'll see these dams and you can see their effect. In fact, we've done it for so many years now that we don't think we can do much more damming or prevent any more water loss. And this is having an adequate effect. We'll talk more about that in a moment. We do have a dipping platform and a pond, which was dug about 30 years ago. And we use that, particularly on open days, for Joe Public to get access to the critters that live in the pond, such as here. We have an annual open day run by the volunteers on International Bog Day, which is usually the last Sunday in July each year. And this is from years in the past. And young folk and slightly less young folk get to close up and serious looking at caddisfly larvae and things like that. Now, that's one way of enjoying the bog. But let's see another way that I tried to teach Ewan McIlford from Radio Scotland and out of doors once, how to lie in a bog and really appreciate it. So let's see if this little 20-second slip actually works.
Peatlands are the best place in Scotland to lie down and feel the earth spinning below you. And then you can get a really good close-up of Scotland's rainforest.
Now that little video was put out on Twitter feed this year by the IUCN UK Peatlands campaign to advertise the International Bog Day, Open Day. And they did that because for this time in the hour of COVID, we couldn't in fact have an open day where we were working close to the public. It had to be a self-service open day. And so we put these flags up by the entrance to the reserve. And actually, quite a number of people saw this and came in and helped themselves to the materials and the already dipped trays of interesting insects and the like that we had provided. This pair of people here are actually SWT members, and they'd heard about the open day, from the advertising put out by headquarters at SWT, which was great. They'd never been to Red Moss before. They live in the Lothians, and that was a great success in advertising, not just to Joe Public, but to our members, to get them here. This person here, her name is Naomi MacLeod, and she was helping me set up. She is actually a local to Red Moss of Balerno, and she actually, as an undergraduate student at St Andrews University, this year in May, completed an estimation of carbon stocks of a lowland raised bog in southeast Scotland. In other words, the Trust and many other nature bodies have been saying how important nature-based solutions are for carbon capture, and of course this Trust has at least half a dozen reserves which contribute to that and hopefully store carbon. For her geography dissertation, she made an estimate that the bog actually stores about 17,000 tons of carbon. But interestingly, she also said we can't know whether this bog is a carbon store or a carbon sink, source or a sink. In other words, whether it's losing carbon slowly or whether it's still accumulating carbon. Now, it's very difficult to tell.
Tim, that's your 8 minutes so far, but I can see you're doing well with the slides.
Yes, we're doing well with, we'll walk over the bog with Ben and Alison Averis, who are professional botanists and who had surveyed the bog 5 years ago. And we were looking at the state of the moss today and the state of the moss back then. And we concluded that while all these bogs in lowland Scotland have been degraded in the past and attempted to drain, but this one has been doing so well in terms of the water table being close to the surface and the widespread of sphagnum mosses, that it was extremely likely that it was in fact a sink, and it was still accumulating and storing yet more carbon. I discussed this with Nature Scott very recently, and they pointed out that the way this is usually expressed is, with the work that we've done over the last 20 and 30 years, with damming and going across the bog and pulling out trees, we can be fairly confident that this bog is now storing 4 tons per hectare, or 100 tons in total, per year, more carbon than it's losing. So that's really good news, and the evidence would seem to suggest that. And as experts, they were going around and looking at these special sphagnums that indicate this. I mentioned that Lothians conservation volunteers go across the bog every year and pull out the tree seedlings, which helps it not to dry out. And I can't help but find this photograph of LCV on site with our friend Ken Knowles. Many of us here, several of us here today were at his funeral 3 hours ago, enjoying himself on the bog. Not only was he convener of Pepperwood for 47 years and Borezinch for more than 15 years, he was also for a few years on my committee at Red Moss of Balerno, helping with the water levels. Rest in peace, Ken. It's wonderful to find this photograph showing you were involved here as well. I was finishing with telling you where it is. Here is the Red Moss of Balerno, and many of you will know there's a car park near there. Now, since COVID, use of the Pendon Hills and this reserve has been so increased that I have to warn you that it's very difficult to park there. And I was hoping to be able to report to you that they're going to expand the car park. They are planning to expand the car park. And hopefully, one day, the bus service, which only gets within 1 mile of it, will allow anybody who's not been there before to visit the reserve. I'll now finish, 40 seconds over, and I'll move on to Pete Sykes at Milkhall Pond, and you can certainly get there by bike, as I did a few years ago. And
excellent. Thank you very much, Tim. Can you stop sharing the screen? Thank you. Again, if you have any questions for Tim or Julian, please remember to put them into the chat box. And we'll now move on to Pete Sykes, who will talk about Milkhall Pond. Thank you very much, Pete.
Okay, right, thank you. First of all, I assume you can see my screen there, Milkhall Pond.
Yep, everything's working fine.
You there? Yep. Yeah, it's one of the Lothian smaller reserves. Whereabouts is it? It's south of Edinburgh, just south of Pennycook. And if you know the Ledburn Inn, or if you know the old Howgate Milk Bar, down from Howgate, a little track, and there it is, only a very small reserve down a very small road, right? But quite a rich habitat there. Right? A little bit of history of it. It was built as a reservoir back in 1854 to provide water for the paper mills down in Pennycook. Last used 1928, but you can still see some of the old pipes heading off down towards Pennycook. And I'm sure that there's going to be some of you out there who will remember this document here, this appeal back in 1976, right, asking all the members in the Lothians branch to donate 50p by cheque or postal order, right, to raise £500 to purchase the reserve. And that was April 1976, and I'm pleased to say it was purchased later that year. The management of it, obviously there's the pond habitat and the woodland shelter belt, which we'll talk about later. And as I said, it's you know, it's a bird reserve, you know, pond. You think, you know, it's all about birds. There's actually a lot of wetlands, woodlands, and a lot more than just the bird life there. So let's talk about the main habitats on the reserve. First of all, although I'm going to say Milkhall Pond, I'm going to talk about the woodland first, and it's down this eastern side. Some of it's been there many, many years. There's some big old splendid beech there. Some of it has been planted in the last 30, 40 years. Some of it down here was planted only a year or two ago. Right. Obviously, we've got the main reservoir here, the focus of the reserve. It's spring fed from this southeast corner here, right? So when it freezes over, as it had done just last week, this area down in the south remains unfrozen. So you usually get quite a good view. I've seen upwards of 30 mallards sitting on there. And only a handful of geese are taking time out from Gladhouse, but there's often some there in this time of year. But yeah, it's always open water there because it is spring fed. The ponds and wetlands here, this was initially when the reserve was acquired. Pretty rank piece of grassland, but I think it was 1984. They dug 4 ponds here and set them up with a set of ditches and canals that sort of join them all up, so the water flows from the main reservoir down through the ponds and finally into the lead burn. They're also spring fed from the southwest corner, so you know, they're quite boggy piece of land there, but with some ponds. There's access and a footpath runs through the reserve. So from the road down here, there's a footpath runs all the way through. It's only a few hundred yards. Don't get over enthusiastic. You're not on a big trek going through this reserve. And then there's egress here onto the railway line. And this is the old railway line, goes south from Pennycook down towards Peebles through the Leadburn. Rumour has it that one day Sustrans will convert it into a cycleway, but that's still a long way away at the moment. It's a bit of an enterprise walking it as a path, but it's well worth it. And finally, of course, there's the Leadburn, mostly pretty straightened and canalised, but meanders around the top of the reserve. Relatively fast-flowing brook. There are fish in there. There are reputedly trout in there. Every time I've been there with the Friday team, somebody has looked at the burn by the bridge and yelled, "Ooh, dipper." I must report, I have never yet seen it myself. Right. But let's go and focus a little bit on those habitats. The woodland habitats, there's native species, rowan alder, planted around about the 1980s, 1990s by reserve volunteers. There's also quite a few mature oak and beech in there. We do have ash dieback in there, but there's plenty of other dead trees which are providing a wonderful habitat for the birds, for the woodpeckers, for the insects. So if the ash dies back, a shame, but you know, that's what happens. There's actually a very mixed, varied understory layer in this woodland as well. Some of it's pretty bleak underneath the beech. You know, there's no light there at all. But others, it's really quite rich grassland, and obviously quite a lot of fungi there too. The reservoir, I have to say, doesn't always look like this. Occasionally there are clouds. some open, well, mostly open water, but quite a lot of horsetail along the side here, which is actually really useful. It's excellent cover for the nesting birds. Right? And one thing I have noticed about the reservoir is with a couple of grey herons, frequent visitors, with 20 or 30 pairs of rooks nesting in the woodlands up on the horizon here, with an otter around and with a couple of swans who will bully anything off the reserve. The breeding success, it's there, but it's not brilliant. I counted 11 little ducklings earlier this year, went back a week later and found there was one. The dab chicks get away with it. I think they're just very, very good at hiding. But yes, it's tough at the bottom of the food chain, but it is well worthwhile going in there as an ornithologist having a look. You will see quite a lot there. I said the grebes are there, the little grebes are there, the swans. There's mallard, there's moorhen, there's coot. There's quite a lot there. On the ponds and wetlands, very, very mixed of grassland and wetland. The swans have actually been nesting. We've got a pair of mute swan. They appeared 3 years ago and they've nested successfully for the last 3 years. And they're nesting on one of the islands in the middle of the top of these ponds. Right. Pond 3 was a bit of a nightmare. There was barely any water opened. So 2020, we started some maintenance. It turned into my lockdown project. And as you'll see here, that's my lockdown buddy. I was socially isolating, and when I got back home from working in that, I was told to go and socially isolate again until I'd been through a shower. But we finished it late last year. So that was what Pond 3 looked like in 2019. This is what Pond 3 looks like now. I'm kind of hoping that this island in the middle, which is where most of the spoil got put, will grow, will provide a useful habitat. But it's certainly good to see it's open water, and we're starting to see some pond flowers, some pond flora growing in there. It's not just a muddy hole anymore.
Pete, that's a 2-minute warning for you.
2-minute warning. Right, quick look at the bird life there. Pair of mute swans. They're 5 eggs each year. Last couple of years, one's been moribund, and they've finished up with 2 or 3 cygnets that they've raised to maturity. Right, the little grebes are there. I say they're excellent hiders, and I'm claiming that one as a sighting of stickleback as well. Right. Grey wagtail, I've only seen this once, so this is one of Neville's pictures, but it is there. It's really good for damselflies, and I'm indebted to Tony Wiggle, who's an excellent photographer for these two. And I've sat there in the reserve in one corner of one pond, counting about 20 iridescent blue damselflies dancing in front of me. They'll pop out sometime in June and be there till late July, August. It's fascinating just to see them. Right. A couple of years ago, previous 2 years, we've had absolutely squillions of frogs. You can barely move for them. They are all over the place. And then this last year in 2021, hardly any. I have no explanation for that at all, but I know the grey herons were really disappointed. Mammals, I've seen roe deer, I've seen hare, I've seen a shrew very briefly. I haven't seen the fox, but I have seen fox prints and fox sprints. And we know there's rabbits there because the little darlings digging holes in the pond bank. But last year, some of the residents nearby sent me the video, and we've only before seen otter tracks and otter sprakes, but now we know we have seen otters on the reserve as well, right, which is excellent. So you're welcome to come and visit. Please ask me if you want to know any more about the reserve. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much indeed, Pete. And if you could stop sharing your screen. Perfect. Well done. Right. The next person on our list is Nick Warren, who's going to talk to us about Johnston Terrace Gardens. So, Nick, are you there?
Yeah, just a minute. Just
At least you're sharing your screen. Oh, no, you're not. Okay, here we are.
no, I think I'm
Okay.
sharing my screen now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. We can see it now.
Great. Great. Yes. Thanks, Alan, and hi everyone. Welcome to Johnston Terrace. So I'll give you a quick whiz tour around the reserve. I can see if I can get this. I don't know why I'm in my display settings a bit over the place here. Anyway, I'll keep going.
It looks fine to us, Nick.
Okay, great. Thanks. So Johnston Terrace, as you can see from the picture and the map, is very much at the heart of Edinburgh, just in the footstep of the castle. Johnston Terrace is the Trust's smallest reserve at 660 square meters. It's about the size of a tennis court and its playing area. It's been in the land is owned by Edinburgh Council, and it's been under Scottish Wildlife Trust management since 1982. At the time, the Scottish Wildlife Trust actually had its headquarters just around the corner at 25 Johnston Terrace. I thought that this the satellite image from Google Earth actually showed the reserve, the size of the reserve, quite nicely, and really you're just talking about a garden reserve, because it's, as you can see, it's not the biggest. It's got plenty of charm, of course. To access the reserve, you've got to come down these steep steps, or up or down these steep steps. So if you're coming up from the grass market, and down, you're coming down from nearby the castle, really. And these steps unfortunately limit access to the reserve, but they are called the Patrick Geddes steps. And as a lot of you will know, Patrick Geddes had many talents, but he was very well known as an urban planner. And he also was very well known for his belief and his desire to make sure that culture and nature are interlinked and interdependent to one another. And I think the Johnston Terrace very much speaks to this. It's a wonderful nod to Patrick Geddes. And I really like the fact that the reserve is so well attuned to the name of the steps that lead to it. And I too, as I got to know the reserve, I got to read a bit more about Patrick Geddes. I found this quote, which I really thought was rather nice. And it is interesting sometimes to stop and think and wonder what the place you're currently at used to be like in the time past, who walked there and what the walls have seen. When the reserve came under trust management in 1982, as you can see, it was very much a blank slate. Not much was happening there, and the trust really just tried to recreate a habitat using native species. It's really the focus of this reserve is to demonstrate what can be done to encourage nature even in small spaces. As you visit, you'll see trees and all apart from the invasives that Julian was referring to, all species there were intended to be native wildlife. And you'll see that there's a small boardwalk, as you can see on one of the pictures, a meadow, some trees and shrubs, and a lovely ivy wall, which provides plenty of food and habitat for the wildlife there. So what you'll see there, you'll see ideas. If in your own garden you say, oh, how can I attract wildlife or make more space for wildlife? You can establish a flower-rich lawn, pile up leaves and logs, start composting, plant trees and shrubs for wildlife, make a wildlife pond, pull up your paving, put away the pesticides, provide wildlife housing. And all of these aspects are really just, you can see aspects of it within the wildlife reserve. What I as I visit this reserve, you have to pay. It's not, you don't see many of the big charismatic animals given its location, and you've got to on top of enjoying the peace and quiet that it provides at the heart of the city, you pay attention to the detail, the interactions between the animals and the plants as the seasons progress. You notice, like, just different plants come to flower at different times of year, and you also look at house sparrows, which you quite often associate with them eating crumbs along just the streets of Edinburgh, but actually on the reserves they display many natural behaviors, like balancing on swaying blades of grass as they eat their seeds. And it's just really quite nice. And also it's a demonstration that nature is pretty fantastic, and if you give nature a little bit of a chance and a little bit of space, it will come back, it will be there. And so far there's been over 250 species of plants and animals being recorded on this site, but I know by looking at the species list for the site that this is still a modest estimate as to how many species are there, because a number of taxa have yet to be fully explored and basically marked down, like onto the species list. So I'm sure that number will go into quite easily into the 300. And for such a small site in the heart of the city, I always find that pretty wonderful. But Edinburgh, but this wildlife is also, this reserve is also a place important for people and important for the local communities. A lot of the locals use it as a haven of peace. The schools and the nursery schools use it for their forest school and their forest wildlife education. And it's got a strong association with the arts. It's got twice a year, usually once or twice a year, it welcomes exhibitions, and it's during the Edinburgh Art Festival, it opens up during the whole month. And that association with the arts makes it a very popular reserve. And several thousand, I think in August, despite the COVID restrictions and the subdued festival, over 5,000 people, just under 5,000 people visited this reserve in that month. So this is my final slide, just to say, in terms of management, it really doesn't require too much. The meadow gets cut down and the cuttings get put onto the compost at the end of summer, early autumn, and the trees and shrubs get cut back in winter time in order for them not to overwhelm the site, really. My biggest task when I, as a convener, and on top of enjoying it and learning about it and learning about looking at the small things and the details of things, is to unfortunately the unglamorous job of picking up all the rubbish. Given its city centre location, it's a task I have to do rather regularly. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. And I didn't even need to give you a 2-minute warning.
I told you so.
You did.
I'll stop sharing.
Okay, if you could stop sharing your screen, that'd be great. And we will now move on to Leslie Fairweather, who is going to talk to us about Woodhall Dean. And thank you very much. There you are, Leslie.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Good. Woodhall Dean is a wonderful reserve, and if you haven't been there, you've got to go. When it says here largely unseen, it's because you need to be quiet to see things that are well hidden. It's a 60-hectare reserve owned by Scottish Wildlife Trust, bought in 1985 and extended in 1986 and 1993. So with the expansion, we've been able to enlarge the woodland, which is the kind of reserve it is. It's 6 kilometres south of Dunbar, 3 kilometres south of Spot, And there, as you go down to the ford, you'll see a little car park where you can park, and then you can go off on the circular walk, which goes through the middle of the reserve. That shows the reserve itself. It's rather sprawling, but you see the central part in the middle, and these two long arms. One has the Weatherly Burn, the other has the Woodhall Burn, and they meet together in the centre of the reserve. And you probably saw the renovated bridge that Julian was talking about in Woodhall Dean. That is just about there. Now, the best time probably to go to Woodhall Dean is in the spring, because the bluebells are wonderful. It's there are obviously other flowers as well, primroses, red campion, wild strawberry, all sorts of things, and dog's mercury, which is the indicator of ancient woodland. But I think the springtime is wonderful. The main structure is the pack horse bridge. It's safe, although it doesn't look it, and they did try to get it fixed, but it's very expensive to fix something like that. So it has been made safe, and you see the Weatherly Burn just underneath, and it's just up from this pack horse bridge, the main bridge that you cross over, you can see it. And if you're there at the right time, there's a wonderful clump of wood vetch just on top of the pack horse bridge, which is quite unusual. Now, to get down to the nitty gritty, it's the trees that are interesting. Wonderful old oaks, old ash, and recent experiments have shown that these are about 200 years old. So wonderful, wonderful trees. And in particular, the oak is very special because it's sessile oak, which means that there's no stem attached to the acorns. It's a special pure breed of oak. It's not like the Quercus robur. This is Quercus petrea, and it is a pure sessile tree and has been admired by many, including Peter Quelch. That's the acorn attached directly to the stem, and you know therefore it's a sessile oak. And we're trying to keep that purity by taking the acorns, and David will talk about this later, bringing them on in the tree nursery, bringing them back, and keeping up this purity. You'll see two pictures here. Left-hand side is a wonderful boundary oak in all its full glory. And on the right-hand side, they're coppiced oak, and you'll see it's actually quite flat there. Woodhall Dean is not flat, it's full of steep deans, but they were able to make, do some coppicing here and make charcoal with the charcoal burners there and take the tannin from the bark. So there were products taken from these trees at one time, but no longer. You'll see underneath it's mainly Luzula sylvatica, which is wood rush, which makes a kind of carpet. So regeneration is not easy, and it's not made easy by the number of roe deer. We've got a lot of roe deer there, but it's still very attractive. But you won't see any bracken under the trees, whereas if you go a bit further, you'll see a lot of bracken, and that's one of our problems. We don't usually lose volunteers in the bracken, but I think we're about to lose this one. To plant the trees, we bash the bracken, and you'll see a volunteer here protecting the trees. We have to protect them from herbivores. Bole guard, stake, wire basket, and as the trees grow, we sometimes increase the height of the wire basket. And then when they're established, we can take all that away, and we've got a lovely mature, pure sessile oak, and they are wonderful trees. Not just the trees, or they're the main thing, but we have a lot of bird boxes. You'll see Neville there cleaning one out, probably getting fleas and ticks and all sorts of things. But the birds that use it are the blue tits and the great tits. And recently, we've had redstart nesting in the boxes and nuthatch, which has been quite interesting. And Stan DePrato will remember doing CDCs way, way back. And I bet he didn't find a nuthatch then. Over here with Peter Leach fixing up an owl box. This is an old one and he's since made a new one. And we've had barn owls and tawny owls in the wood. And it's really rich in birds. It's also rich in bats. We've added more bat boxes. And I think you've seen this one already, but it's pipistrelles, which we get both at Roslyn Glen and at Woodhall Dean. And there'll be soprano or common pipistrelle. Fabulous. And if we're really lucky, we see a brown long-eared bat. This will be Peter Leach because he has a license and he can handle the bats. And just to see their long ears and their huge wings, to see it up close in the hand is just wonderful. We've got bigger mammals, we've got badgers. I can't remember who took this photograph, but it's amazing. I've seen them at night, but not during the day. There's a huge set up in the reserve, which has been there for a long, long time, and plenty of outposts. So badgers not endangered at Woodhall Dean. Fewer adders now than there used to be, and I think it's probably because more people are using the reserve. There are dogs coming through. They should be on leads, but sometimes they're not. And they're disturbed more now, I think. But wonderful if you can see one, which you should do if you're quiet. Common lizards, again, you've got to be quiet to see them. They hide very, very quickly, but lovely to see. We couldn't plant on this area. This was an area that was bought later, and we planted a lot of it up, but some areas the wind just blew. So we've made them into meadows. Again, Neville does quadrats, checking what's coming in. And a lot of volunteers will cut and rake and take off the hay once a year. And hopefully in another 10 years, we might have a very special meadow. It's coming, but it's slow.
Leslie, that's a 2-minute warning.
Okie doke. Volunteers are wonderful, and we have a lot of them, and we're very, very grateful to them all. One other thing we do is to repair the walls. That's Bill Bruce checking up on the rebuilding of a wall, probably broken down by roe deer, but it's all done. And on the right-hand side, you can see how the wall looks as if it's never been tampered with. I'm not very good because I'm too impatient. And lastly, good old Bob and Betty Smith. This is their bench. We put it up in memory of them. They're both dead now. But I took over from Bob Smith. He was convener of Woodhall Dean. I did a 5-year apprentice under him. And then I took over 20 years ago. He died 20 years ago. So it's a wonderful bench and reminds me of the Smiths. And if you're doing the circular walk, make sure you sit there with a coffee or tea or picnic and look over the reserve because it's absolutely stunning. Thank you.
Excellent, Leslie. Thank you very much indeed. And well, now we will have a talk from David Ross and find out what he's doing with those acorns.
Hey, thank you very much, Alan. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah, if you can share your screen, that'd be fine.
Just give me a second, please, while we swap operators and swap presentations.
Yeah, that looks fine.
I think we're in business. Okay, thank you. And good evening, everyone. As you've heard, my name is David Ross, and I volunteer on East Lothian and Midlothian Reserves, including Roslyn Glen, where I'm the convener of the Reserve Management Committee. Roslyn Glen Reserve is located on the southern side of the valley of the North Esk, between the villages of Rosewell and Roslyn, and it's a remnant of semi-natural woodland that was once much more common in central Scotland. It's a beautiful setting, beautiful valley setting, and is well worth a visit. I'm not going to talk about Rosenglen tonight, however, but instead I'd like to give you a brief introduction to the small tree nursery where, with the help of volunteers, we raise native tree seedlings for planting out in our local wildlife reserves. Many of the SWT wildlife reserves in Lothians, as elsewhere, have a continuing need for new native trees. This is both to expand their woodland cover and to increase their biodiversity, as well as to replace trees which are being lost for various reasons, such as disease, storm damage, or simply old age. It's important that these trees are acquired locally from reliable sources, particularly as we're now aware that many tree diseases have been introduced in the past and plants imported from abroad. Many of the trees introduced into our reserves are purchased from local reputable tree nurseries, but a significant number also come from our own volunteer-run nursery. The nursery is located within the University of Edinburgh's Bush Estate near Pennycook. It's divided up into separate beds and is protected by a high deer fence to keep the local roe deer at bay. It also has rabbit netting around it, as we have quite a few rabbits in the area. Compost bins are used to recycle all suitable plant material, including grass cuttings, leaves, etc. And this is composted and then dug back into the nursery beds to help enrich them. Where planting is to take place in a wildlife reserve with a SSSI, a Site of Special Scientific Interest designation, as with a reserve like Rosenglen or Woodhall Dean, as we've been hearing about, it is generally essential that source material such as seeds are only gathered from that reserve. This helps maintain the genetic purity of the plants being introduced back into the site. Records are kept of all trees brought into and taken out of the nursery. Several methods are used for tree propagation depending on the species. We raise more oaks than any other species, and they are raised from seed, as are others such as hazel, hawthorn, rowan, and holly. In the case of oaks, acorns are collected from trees in our reserves in the autumn and sown in pots, as you can see here, protected from mice over the winter until the seed has germinated and grown enough to be planted out in the tree nursery. Another method we use is to take cuttings, which are planted directly into the prepared nursery bed. And this works well for the likes of bird cherry, dean, and willow, as well as a few other species. Some tree species lend themselves to propagation from root cuttings, where in the case of aspen, which is possibly one of my favorite trees and is a highly underrated Scottish native broadleaf, sections of root are collected, potted up in compost, from where they'll send out new shoots. The shoots are then pruned from the root and grown on before being planted out in the nursery bed. It's always satisfying to see the first growth appearing and to be able to move on to the next stage where the seedlings are moved into the tree nursery. Here they'll be planted out in beds and they will spend the next 2 or 3 years, possibly more, before being transferred into the SWT reserves. The hard work is not finished at this stage, as quite a bit of weeding and care is still required, but it's all made easier with much willing help and always more enjoyable with some warm, sunny weather and good company. When the trees are large enough to fend for themselves and not too old to receive too much of a setback from moving, the fun can really begin. At this stage, they can be transplanted into the reserves. The small trees are generally planted, as we could see from Leslie's example earlier from Woodhall Dean. They're generally planted within a protective cage fashioned out of chicken wire. And we generally, particularly where there are long rank grasses, they're further protected by a plastic vole guard to protect them from the base of the tree being nibbled. It takes a few years to get the trees to this stage you see sitting in the trailer here. So the last thing we want to do is to see them being eaten within a week or so of planting, and we take quite a bit of care at that stage. Tree planting in the reserves is always one of the most keenly anticipated and rewarding tasks enjoyed by the volunteers. As we can see here, a few years ago now, this slide, but as we can see here at Woodhall Dean, and more recently at Brock, another East Lothian reserve, where an area of non-native Sitka spruce was clear felled, and it gave us an opportunity to further extend the native broadleaf woodland. It's certainly much more enjoyable planting the trees than some of the work that's still to come at this stage, such as bracken bashing. And as you can see from Leslie's slide earlier, with one of our volunteers, Frank, up to the top of his head in bracken, it's not a great deal of fun. But as I said earlier, the tree planting is probably one of the highlights.
David, that's you got 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Alan. With a few more years of care and attention, hopefully we can then start to see the development of a bit of new native wood with all the benefits that that will bring with it. Over the years, the tree nursery has also been used to nurture tree seedlings bought as very small plants from commercial nurseries, and they're then grown on for a year or two before planting out into the reserves. We've also supplied a very small number of plants to other organisations, including the Rangers at the Lothian Council. As you can see from this slide, oaks have been by far our most commonly grown species over the last 20 or so years, which this covers. We've raised in excess of 2,000 of these. Other species really represent the local native tree species that you would expect to find in our native woods. In total, we raised and planted into reserves something over, the total is now over 3,500. The tree nursery is a small-scale enterprise, but an enjoyable and rewarding one, nevertheless. And hopefully it's also a worthwhile one, adding to the value and beauty of our local reserves. And we really do hope that you enjoy visiting them and can enjoy the peace and quiet of walking through a new piece of woodland such as this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David. That I have to give some congratulations to our speakers tonight, because they were asked to spend 10 minutes and most of them have spent 10 minutes. Okay, our next speaker to wrap things up is Julian Warman. So Julian, would you like to share your screen? Yeah. Can you just say something, Julian?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's
Trying to
working fine.
advance it from difficulty advancing it. Yeah, let's try again. I can't get it to change slide. Just a second. Seems to not want to change the slide. Come on. Just a second. Yeah, it's just not.
Well, do you want us to have a quick, go around with, see if there's any questions while you maybe restart and see if you can get the slides to work?
Yeah, you can see my shared screen, can you?
We can see the shared screen, yes.
Yeah, but when I try to advance it or escape from it, it's just not playing ball.
Yeah.
I'll try and stop share and see what that does. All right.
It seems to be a good question for David, Alan, in the
Yeah.
chat. Just
Hold on just a second. Julian started sharing again, so let's see what happens. There we go. Okay, that seems to be working now. So we'll come back to that question for David at the end. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Right. Sorry about that. All right. See if this works. I'm not going to spend a few minutes just some of the opportunities for wildlife in Scotland that we can see coming up in the future. So a relatively recent threat that we're experiencing and have experienced for several years now is ash dieback. This was first recorded in the UK in 2012, and it was first recorded. I first saw it at Pease Dean, a trust reserve just off the A1 in the Scottish borders in 2014, and now it's found almost right across the country. It's estimated that around 80%, possibly higher, of ash trees could be killed by ash dieback, and what we're seeing is certainly suggesting that to be the case. Ash is an important component of native woodland in southeast Scotland, so the impact of ash dieback on trust woodland reserves will be really significant and can already be seen at reserves pictured, like this one pictured here. This is Roslin Glen, where we don't ordinarily cut down the ash trees when they've got ash dieback, but in this case this is next to the Glen Road that runs up to Rosewell, so it presented a hazard. So we had to do something about it. We were fortunate that they decided to close the road for resurfacing, so that enabled us to do this work. The work's being done by a reserve project officer based at Dalkeith, and he was assisted by myself and volunteers, and but it's still a very costly and time-consuming task, and it's something that's only going to get worse in time, and it's also going to alter the structure of our woodlands quite radically. I'm already seeing them open up quite substantially when the ash dieback gets going. As you see, it's a fungus, and yeah, it's going to, you get, most of you probably already seen it around your localities. Just talking about a couple of threats that I think we're probably going to see on the horizon. Well, one of them definitely. First one is muntjac deer. This is a threat to native woodland again. It's a small deer. It's only 50 centimetres tall at the shoulder, and it was first brought from China to Woburn Park in Bedfordshire in the early 20th century and is now well established in England and Wales. I've looked on a distribution map, and there are only a few records of muntjac deer so far for Scotland, although it's probably only a matter of time before this changes. Muntjac deer feed on trees and shrubs in woodland, and as they can reach high densities, can have a big impact on woodland structure and prevent natural regeneration. I've seen this down in, well, it must be about 20 years ago in a woodland near Peterborough, and yeah, the impact was quite incredible, really. Another one, which we're not sure if it's going to be a threat or not, but it's certainly something to look out for, is the ring-necked parakeet. It's another introduced non-native species. It's probably going to become more numerous in Scotland in the future, although the impact it's going to have on native bird species is not clear-cut. It's well established in and around London, The RSPB estimates that there's a population there of just under 9,000 breeding pairs. But there is a small breeding population in Glasgow, so I suspect that's going to probably head east in time, unless something happens to it otherwise. The concern is that it's a hole nester, so it may have impact on native species of hole nesting birds. It tends to nest quite early in the season, so it's bagged those sites before our own native species can get there. So things like the great spotted woodpecker and nuthatch, which we already mentioned. But one at the bottom is probably going to be the biggest potential threat to nature conservation in the coming years. But possibly some of the opportunities in future for nature conservation could maybe alleviate some of that impact if we're quick about it. So, for instance, if we can increase the scale of land restoration for nature conservation across the country massively, that could possibly mitigate against climate change effects. For example, as well as absorbing carbon as wet, healthy peatland accumulates more peat. Examples of large-scale nature conservation projects in Scotland include such private landowners up in Glenfeshie and conservation organisations such as Trees for Life at Glen Affric. And there's also the Coigach and Assynt Living Landscape Core project, which the Trust is a part of. Closer to us, there is a project in the planning stage that the Trust is involved in called Riverwoods, which plans to connect up and create a continuous native riparian habitat along watercourses. This could involve extending native habitat from Trust reserves, so they become part of a wider network of sites for wildlife across the Lothians and further afield. So, for instance, a project like Riverwoods might be able to link up sites such as Brockwood, Woodhall Dean and Thornton Glen. Okay, thanks very much.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed, Julian. So we're going to open this up now to questions. We've already got a few questions in the chat box, on the chat room. Julian, would you like to, or Mike, would you like to ask your questions, or do you want us to ask them on your behalf?
I'm happy to do it either way.
Well, you ask the question. I think it's probably the easiest way.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all the speakers for an interesting evening. David, I was wondering if there has been assessment of success in the tree planting, and the effort is worthwhile. Clearly, a lot of them survive, but has there been actually any formal assessment of how many survive, for example, to a certain age or size?
Thank you, Mike. Good evening, and thanks for the question. In a short word, the answer to that really is no. There hasn't been an assessment made. We can only tell how successful the trees are being by what we've been able to see over the last 20, 25 years while we've been working on these. And the feeling is that the success rate to that age, we don't have any trees we've planted much older than that, but the success rate is very, very good indeed. We tend to carry out a bit of tree care each year, going round the trees, weeding back bracken and so on. And if we find any dead trees, we mark that by turning the top of the basket over so that we can get a feeling for how many there are in any one area of planting. And generally, we're only seeing 1 or 2 trees out of 100 at any time not succeeding. So the feeling is that the success is pretty good, but we don't have figures.
Okay, thank you. Mike, why don't you stay on the line and ask your question to Julian about the links?
Thank you very much. I was just going to say to David that certainly...
And then we'll come to Annie about the other question to Julian.
Sure. I was just going to reply to David that certainly the trees planted at Boar's Inch seem to do pretty well. So that fits with the general picture he gave us. Julian, I was interested in the possible spread of muntjac. We had a good talk on lynx recently, possible reintroduction of lynx recently from Scottish Wildlife Trust. And I know that they are normally specialist predators on roe deer. I wonder if anybody knows, whether they would also take muntjac and help to control possible spread of muntjac if and when lynx were ever reintroduced, particularly in southern Scotland.
I don't know the answer to that question. I suppose it would. I'm just trying to think if muntjac are actually. I don't actually know if muntjac are, as I say, they're species from China that happen to be here because the owner of Woburn Park decided he wanted some in his estate. I don't know if muntjac coincide with the range of lynx, so we'd actually know whether lynx took muntjac deer. So the question would be: are muntjac deer on the continent, for instance, where lynx are countries like France, Switzerland, Italy? So something I'd need to have a look. I'd need to look at. I mean, you'd think they probably would do. It's slightly smaller than a roe deer, so I can't think of any reason why they wouldn't. But whether they've actually experienced them in the wild, I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Meg. Annie, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Julian, I wondered whether if you have muntjac and roe deer in the same space, do the muntjac offer any competition to the roe deer, or do they by any chance give them any diseases?
I don't know if they pass diseases. I don't know how specific deer diseases are. Do they pass from roe deer to red deer to fallow deer and the like? You'd expect they probably would do, but the short answer is, again, I don't know the answer to that question. In terms of competing, well, they're probably going for the same food source, but whether the numbers are, well, muntjac can occur in quite large numbers, so perhaps they can impact on the food source to such an extent that could have an impact on roe deer. It would really need quite a detailed piece of research to get the answer to that one.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Pete, there was an earlier question to you about otters taking cygnets or ducklings, and I was interested in your reply about cygnets suffering accident as they hit maturity, flying accidents as they hit maturity. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about that?
Yes. Yeah, go back to the numbers. Last 3 years, it's only the last 3 years that pair of mutes ones have been there. They've had 5 eggs in a clutch. The last 2 years, 4 have hatched. In 2019, 2 cygnets died around about this time of year, both the same reason. To the southwest of the reserve, in one of the fields, there's a 10 kV power line running across it, and both of them died in flying accidents coming back into the reserve, learning to fly. 2 casualties in 2 decades isn't going to excite SSEB to do much about the power line. So what we've done there is just 2 years ago now, we planted about 15 willow trees, and the plan is that as they grow up, they will kind of block the gap, right, and force any birds coming in over that field across the power lines. It'll force their flight path higher, right, when the trees grow. So hopefully we mitigate the problem that way. This year, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was a dead cygnet in the middle of the pond. I spoke to one of the locals, and they were attributing it to a flying accident coming into land. And the only other cygnet death I know of was when they all wandered off up the road to one of the more distant ponds. There's a small pond about half a mile away. They set off with 4 cygnets and came back with 3. We have no clue what happened to the other. So yeah, of the 4 cygnets that have died in the last 3 years, 3 have gone to flying accidents. Yeah, we can mitigate in a few years as those willows grow. But yeah, that's the way I know they've been going.
Okay, no, it's interesting. It's good that you're taking some action to try and avoid them hitting those power lines at least.
Yeah.
I've got no more questions in the chat room. Is there anybody else out there with a question that they would like to ask? Just unmute yourself and ask. Oh, I've got one more from Joe now. Joe, would you like to ask a question?
It's actually from Richard, who's sitting beside Joe.
Oh, right, okay.
It's just seeing the plastic dams being used for blocking up the drains on Red Moss and elsewhere. Should a degradable material like timber or some iron, even if it's say corrugated iron or something which is basically degradable in the long term, should that be used? Is there any intention of extracting these plastic from the moss? Because obviously the plastic could be there forevermore, essentially.
Sounds like one for you, Tim.
Oh no, I think that's one for Julian.
Yeah, I can answer that.
I know he can. On you go.
Okay, so if we were setting out to dam ditches now, we probably wouldn't use plastic piling because there are better techniques nowadays. I mean, the plastic piling's been around for about 20 years probably. If we were to do it now, the technique would probably would require a piece of machinery, but essentially what you do is you use peat. So you take peat from another part of the bog and you stick it into the ditch. So it's totally biodegradable, obviously. Yeah, so it's a thing I've struggled with extracting them. They're all mapped, so at some point in the future they could be extracted. But again, that would require a piece of machinery going out there because the suction on peat is so strong. It is actually phenomenally difficult to pull something out of peat once it's been hammered in place. But yeah, it's potentially possible. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
To that, Alan.
Pardon?
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
There is in fact, if you go out there and look at some of those runs, there is in fact a very, very old, which I think I broke my back putting in 30 years ago, wooden dam in there, but it has totally now disintegrated, which is why it had to be replaced effectively with plastic. So as each generation goes on, we have to keep adapting the technique.
Okay, thank you. Right. Unless there are any more questions, I think we're going to have to draw this to a close because it's now almost 9 o'clock. And I would just like to thank each of our speakers very much indeed. They were asked to speak for 10 minutes. They stuck to their 10 minutes and that was great. So I'm going to close the meeting by saying thank you very much to all the speakers. I do apologize to those of you. Some of the sound quality was slightly variable. That's because people are calling in from various places, but hopefully it didn't spoil the enjoyment too much. Our next meeting is on the 17th of February 2022. There isn't a meeting in January, and it's going to be on cetaceans and seabirds. From Orkney to the Antarctic or the Southern Ocean. It's going to be by a gentleman called John Dickens of St Andrews University, who has been using photo ID to identify and count anything from whales to seals to seabirds. And he's currently working on a project counting harbour seals in Orkney. So that should prove to be an interesting talk. And all I can say is I wish I could wish you a very Merry Christmas, but I'm not sure it's going to be very many for many of us. And hopefully a happier new year than it's been this year for many. So thank you very much indeed to all the speakers, and I will now stop recording.